right, y'all. We've all heard some bad sermons, right? And if you've been around academia for any length of time, you're gonna hear some bad academic presentations. And yet, it occurs to me that for some reason, I have a lot more memories of people giving painfully bad academic presentations than I have of people giving painfully bad sermons. Now, this may be in part because when critical thoughts about a sermon intrude upon my mind, I do have at least some sense of moral obligation to try to have a good attitude and not to be overly critical. Um, but my conscience is probably a little bit less tender and self-aware when I'm the audience, part of the audience of an academic presentation. And yet, I think that there's more to it than just kind of my obdurate, sinful conscience. I think part of the reason that I have more memories of lousy academic presentations is because even novice preachers have at least heard hundreds of sermons. And so even if they're in their first year of homiletics, they at least have a reasonable set of instincts around what you ought to do and ought not to do in a sermon. By contrast, it's possible that the first time you attend an academic conference, it might also be the first time that you're presenting at one. And to make matters a little bit worse, you might end up giving your presentation right after a talk by somebody else who's been giving papers for 20 or 30 or 40 years, which will, of course, offset any disparity in your capacity highlight any disparities between yourself and the other presenter vis-a-vis your capacities as an academic presenter. So the goal of this little chat is to shorten your learning curve about how to give a paper at an academic conference, with the goal of you being able to represent your research well, get yourself invited to the next conference, and maybe even have the chance to modestly brush off a bit of praise after you totally nail your first presentation. Here's an overview of what we're going to be talking through today. I will start talking a bit about the structure of a good academic presentation, and then I'll move on to talk about the content, what you put into that presentation. I'll include some comments on what good presentation style entails, and also talk a little bit about what sorts of visual aids would be most useful for people to have on hand in order to be able to appreciate your argument. I'll also discuss what it looks like to give the paper well, what your performance in the moment looks like. And finally, I'll talk about how to conduct yourself well during the Q&A session, the question and answer session at the end of the program. But let's start with the structure of the presentation. Your presentation should always begin with some kind of an engaging and concise hook, something that will capture the attention of your audience. Now, you don't want that hook to be something that goes on and on because you're invariably going to have a very limited amount of time, but it needs to be enough to perk up people's attention and make them want to give you a little bit of their focus. Thereafter, you need to very promptly identify your thesis statement quite explicitly. And that means saying something like, this paper will argue, or my thesis is, highlight it. Don't make them sniff around for it. Don't be afraid that that looks ham-fisted or inelegant. Make it really obvious to your readers or your listeners what it is that you're going to be arguing. Now, this is, of course, just a good practice in writing in general. And a lot of the things that I'm going to say, especially about structure and content, do apply also to good academic writing. But all of the importance of the basics of good writing practice is really multiplied in an oral presentation. Because if it's an oral presentation, nobody can review what you've said out loud. Whereas if somebody's read something and they realize they've missed something, they can go pop back and read it again. People are only going to have one shot at understanding what is the content of your presentation. So make that thesis really clear. You also want to include abundant, what I call roadmaps and street signs. Now, what do I mean by a roadmap? The roadmap, if you will, is the section at the beginning of your essay, sometime in your introduction, that lays out the route that your argument is going to follow. That says in advance, these are the steps that I'm going to take in order to demonstrate the veracity of my thesis, and it's like a roadmap, and because you're saying what are the different steps you're going to take and what are the different turns you're going to make. So if you were to look at this map of Paris right over here, and you were to lay out for somebody how it is that you get from the Arc de Triomphe over to Notre Dame, you would say, well, you're going to go from the Arc de Triomphe down the Avenue des Champs-Élysées, you'll cross the river, the Seine at the Musée d'Orsay, you'll walk along the river until you get to Sainte-Chapelle, you'll pop over the island, and then you'll be just next to Notre Dame. That's basically what you're going to do in your paper. You're going to lay out all the different steps that you follow. Then, as you take each step, you're going to point out where you are in your route. And the times that you point out where you are in your route will function like street signs as you follow your route through a given city. Street signs are indications of what step you're at in your argument. You'll be placing them in the form of section headings, for example, at each crucial juncture in your presentation. But having them in a section heading isn't a substitute for also including them in the prose at the important transitions in your argument. So you put them in section headings, you put them in your prose, and that helps people see where you are. So you'll have one that indicates, first we're heading down the Avenue Champs-Élysées. There'll be another one that says, then at the Musée d'Orsay, you cross the river. There'll be another one that says, you go down the river until you get to Sainte-Chapelle. And there'll be another one that says, from Sainte-Chapelle, you'll move quickly just to the east to get to Notre Dame. Your audience's ability to follow the logic of your argument is at least as important as your argument actually being sound. I'm going to say that again because I don't want to undersell it. Your audience's ability to follow your argument is at least as important as it is that your argument be sound. And remember, and this might be a little bit painful, but remember, almost nobody in your audience will know as much about your topic as you do. It is almost certain that nobody cares about it as much as you do. And nobody is going to be paying as much attention as you are. So the onus to be clear and compelling is 100% on you. And having a clear roadmap and having street signs is part of what will help you with that process. The other crucial structural component is, of course, your conclusion. But your conclusion isn't just a way of saying the end. Your conclusion will reaffirm your thesis statement. It will retrace all your steps. In other words, it will basically run you through your street map again. And if you want to be stylistically clever, it might return you to the hook that you use at the beginning to kind of round out the experience aesthetically for people as well. But the really important part is that you reaffirm the thesis and you remind people of the path that you followed in order to demonstrate the truthfulness or the accuracy of your thesis. All of this process will be greatly served, greatly facilitated if you outline in great detail before you start writing. Don't start writing just because you have an idea of where it's going to go. You need to have filled out a robust structural outline that not only has all your major section divisions, all the different steps on your route, but also that includes all the evidence that you plan to use in the course of your argument, so that when you're writing and when you're making an outline and when you're making a PowerPoint and making a handout, you have a very clear sense of how it is that you're making each step. And that kind of transitions us from the topic of the structure to the topic of the content. The first thing to think about in relation to content is, of course, topic selection. What's your presentation going to be about? And what you need to make really clear in your presentation is how your work is making an original contribution to knowledge. What is it that you're saying that they couldn't learn by going to read what somebody else has already written? Now, that feels like a pretty big ask, right? Especially when you're at the beginning of your career. So you also want to resist the contrary urge to overpromise about the importance of your work. You're trying to say something new, but you don't necessarily need to say that you're going to revolutionize people's understanding of Old Testament scholarship, for example. Clear contribution to knowledge, but don't overpromise. And make sure that whatever topic you're going to present about in this given 25-minute academic presentation, make sure the topic you pick can actually really be handled in the space of time that you've got. Don't bite off more than you can chew. Don't try to give a 20-minute presentation that's on your whole thesis. Pick a subsection of your thesis that is appropriate to the amount of time, that's still making an original contribution to knowledge, and then just do that well. So topic selection is one of the key content considerations that will set you up for success. Then, in relation to the topic, you also need to be thinking about what's the most pertinent sort of evidence to demonstrate your original contribution. What sort of data do you need? Do you need biblical texts? Do you need original data from field research? Do you need bibliographical evidence? Are you going to be depending mostly on philosophical and logical argumentation, etc.? This is the sort of stuff that you should be putting into your outline so that you can see what's the strongest evidence that you have going for you, where are there gaps, and where do you maybe have more detail than you're actually going to need for your presentation. A good argument is like an accordion. You can make a good argument as long or as compressed as you need given the limitations of your time. But the process of expanding or contracting your argument is going to be greatly facilitated if you outlined well in advance, because you'll see where it is in advance that you have more data than you need and where it is that you might need to shore up before you go starting to write. Rule of thumb, as you think about what sort of evidence to conclude in your arguments, the rule of thumb, especially for biblical scholars, is that primary sources win arguments. Secondary literature doesn't. So you're going to win your argument using biblical texts, biblical languages, maybe apocryphal text, maybe ancient historical comparative literature. You're not going to win it citing commentaries or other people's articles. So focus on the primary sources. If you happen to be working outside of biblical text, original field data is what's going to win your argument much more than other people's syntheses about original field data. Now, because primary source evidence is what wins arguments and secondary evidence doesn't, you really don't want to spend much time quoting other authors, because the quotation of another author is really not going to be highly compelling to a reader that you're trying to win over to your side in a very short space of time. So that brings me to a few things that you want to minimize as you're selecting the content for your presentation. First thing you minimize, lit review. Nobody wants to hear you run through the 10 other people who have written around your topic. It's not interesting. It's not interesting to you when you wrote it, probably. So don't mess around with it in your academic presentation. Avoid it if it's at all possible. Also, don't spend as much time on caveats in your academic presentations as you might in a written piece. I know that in a written piece, you want to be bulletproof. You want to kind of cover all of your flanks. But in an academic presentation, you have very little time to make your original contribution to knowledge. And so put all the energy that you can on making your case positively. You can have caveats in your footnotes so that they're available to you during Q&A when you explain to people, well, your suggestion about X, Y, and Z is interesting, but it falls outside the parameters of what I was hoping to do in my paper. But don't do all that posturing during your presentation. Just make your case positively. And speaking of being positive, only criticize other scholars if it's really absolutely 100% necessary. Now, this applies in writing also. It can be very uncomfortable, though, to end up in an elevator with somebody who you happen to have recently lambasted orally or in writing, if they happen to run across your critique. And the elevator detail is specific because I've definitely been in that physical elevator before. I was at the North American Patristic Society meeting up, several years ago, and I had published a mixed review of a book in Bryn Mawr Review. Now, the review wasn't nasty. I said some genuinely affirmative things about the work, and I included some gentle criticisms. But when I happened to get stuck in the crowded elevator with the author of that work, all that they remembered were the criticisms. Now, in retrospect, I didn't really gain much of anything from making those negative remarks, even though they're accurate, but I definitely didn't gain a friend in that process. Even if you're not harsh in your critique, even if you're gentle and you're fair and all that, most academics have very thin skin, and they're going to feel the sting of any critique pretty acutely. So really pick your battles. So we've talked about how you structure your argument. We've talked about what you put into your argument. Now let's talk about your style as you put the prose together. The first component of style you need to be thinking about are sentence length and structures. You want to vary the length of your sentences, and you want to alter your structure over the course of your argument. And I know that when I was early career, I had a couple of standardized sentence structures that I would use over and over, and it made for kind of unpleasant reading, as my wife so kindly pointed out to me, because she had to be stuck in elevators with me anyway. But varying the lengths of your sentences is a very simple way to make your oral presentation more engaging. And when in doubt, err on the side of brevity. A little bit of humor goes a long ways, and a little bit of religiosity even more so. So don't try to be overly funny. Don't try to be overly homiletical. Don't try to be overly pious. Don't end your presentations with something like Soli Deo Gloria. It's off-putting for the most part. And if you make a joke, please, Lord, don't wait around for somebody else to laugh, because if they don't, you're going to feel really awkward. That's not to say you don't use humor or that you don't allow your faith to come through, but a little bit is going to go a long way. Let's talk about the words that you use. You don't really want to try to impress anybody with your technical vocabulary in these contexts. The goal is not really for somebody to walk away thinking, gosh, Hepzibah's super smart. If you're in the room, people know that you're smart. The goal is to help the audience to understand your argument and to evaluate whether or not you're right. Now, using a thesaurus can be a good idea as you try to get the vocabulary that you need to make your argument well. But there's a right way and a wrong way to use a thesaurus. The right way to use a thesaurus is to help stimulate your brain to use vocabulary that is within the realm of what your normal active vocabulary is. It's not to help impress people with the shiny big words that you happen to know. So if you end up using a thesaurus in order to source a lot of words that aren't part of your normal verbal domain, your oral delivery is going to come across as artificial or strained. So thesaurus is going to help make your writing more lively, but it needs to be language that's comfortable and natural for you to use. So that's enough about verbal style. One of the other things that you'll do to make your argument compelling and clear and easy to follow is to have visual aids. And don't be thrown off by the fact that you're not likely to be asked to create a visual aid. People won't generally kind of twist your arm to do that, but you should always do that if you possibly have the option. You can ask what sort of visual aids will be allowed, what the technology will allow, but if you can have a handout or a PowerPoint or both, it's going to be hugely beneficial to help people follow the progress of your argument and analyze any key texts that you're going to be using. And if you're going to include like a paragraph of text, then highlight or italicize the key components of those texts that you want people to see so that they're not spending a long time reading extended text while you're talking, okay? With your PowerPoints, use a really big font. My rule of thumb, unless I know that I am presenting on a massive screen, my rule of thumb is to aim to use size 36 in the body of my PowerPoint, nothing less than size 32. So what you've got on the screen right here in my body text is size 36. And depending on what you're reading it on, it might be just right. If you're looking at your phone, it might be too small. But you know what's definitely too small is this nonsense here down in the bottom right-hand corner, which is the sort of PowerPoint that you're going to see with some frequency in academic context. Don't do that. Don't put that amount of information on a slide. Don't put that amount of information on your handouts either. Also, Don't read anything verbatim that is on your PowerPoint. Everybody in the room is literate, so they can read your PowerPoint. You don't need to read it out to them. You also don't want to let your PowerPoint be the most memorable thing about your presentation. I've been in a couple of contexts where the PowerPoint has like noisy animations and like beautiful artwork, and it's very flashy. And I remember the PowerPoint really well, but I have no idea what the person was talking about. The PowerPoint is there to support what you verbally deliver. It is not an alternative to what you verbally deliver. We're all pretty disciplined about editing our own written work. We're not always so disciplined about editing our PowerPoints, often because you put them together kind of at the last minute. But edit your PowerPoint carefully because your text is going to be very, very large and there's not very much of it there. So any mistakes that you make, people will notice. Finally, because especially if you're early in your career and you might not have memorized exactly where all the transitions are, where you need to advance your slides in your PowerPoint, I suggest that you mark on your paper every place that you need to click the mouse in order to advance your slideshow, because it's very disappointing if you happen to have had good information on your slide, but you didn't actually get to share it, and you realize 5 minutes later that your PowerPoint has been dragging behind you. Not a good look. So just help yourself out. Mark on your paper with a highlighter, or writing in the margins, or even typing it in advanced slide or something like that. So those are the visual aids, which will ultimately be underscoring and supporting your performance. That is the dramatic delivery, not overly dramatic, but the delivery, the live delivery of your presentation. Now, what are things that you need to think about to make sure that you deliver effectively, that you perform effectively? Well, one of them is go ahead and do a tech pre-check. Make sure that you can project everything properly from whatever computer you're using. If it's your own laptop, get your laptop up there and connected to whatever you're connecting to in advance. If you're using somebody else's machine, put your files on that desktop and try them in advance, because every single computer has its own demons. And if you're using the computers and the projectors at a conference center, they've got a legion of demons. And you don't want to be fussing around with the projector while you're up at the podium. You want everything to work out smoothly while you're there. Now, prior to actually beginning to read your paper, and you shouldn't be shy at all about just reading what's on your paper, but prior to reading it, maybe as you're getting yourself situated at the podium, you want to kind of open up with a quick line or two of what classical rhetoricians would call captatio benevolentiae. It's something to capture the goodwill of your audience. And it's distinct from the introductory hook that's actually written into your introductory paragraph. The captatio can be a word of thanks to your organizers. Don't be fawning, don't be flattering, be genuine in your appreciation. It can be a quick greeting. It can even be a little joke, which can be slightly or gently self-deprecating, but again, don't come across as needy, don't come across as fawning, okay? It's just something to warm up your audience to you before you start to read what's on your paper. Now, some of us will present in spaces that are thoroughly secular. And some papers that we'll give might really depend on a certain set of epistemic faith commitments or a certain cultural location that's not going to be shared by the audience. If that's the case, it might be necessary for you to say something about your confessional commitments or your social location. But only do that if it's utterly necessary for the coherence of your argument. You don't need to be the kind of person. I mean, I definitely have colleagues and friends who kind of get up there and they can be talking about a lexicographic entry in a dictionary that they've written, but they're going to declare that they're a middle-aged North American cisgender white and heterosexual male. That's not necessarily germane all the time, but it might be that your particular paper that's about Pentecostal pneumatology in Nagaland is benefited by somebody having you clarify for them that you are Pentecostal or that you're not, or that you're from Nagaland or that you're not, or that you're operating from a perspective of religious commitment. If you need to make some kind of declaration of your commitments in advance, do it, but make it quick and short and one line and move on, because it's ultimately not a paper about your personal autobiography. Most important thing you can do, the single most important thing you can do is that you time your presentation by reading it out loud. So you read it out loud in the way that you think that you'll present it. You time it, and then you cut to get down to the time that you need, and you practice it again. And then you cut again. If you're like me, you're going to have to go through this 2 or 3 times until you get down to the right length, and making sure that you're about 30 seconds under the limit that you've been given. Don't speed up your rate of talking in the presentation to get in under the wire. And please don't complain about the time limits you were given or how much you had to cut. This is a very common thing, especially among new presenters at conferences, that, oh gosh, I wrote 12,000 words and I've only got 20 minutes. Like, you knew in advance how much time you had. So complaining about your limitations just basically means that you weren't well prepared. So do your work in advance, cut your words out later, and you can add them back in the publication at some subsequent point. As in homiletics, you want to exploit your vocal range and your rhythms. Now, your goal isn't to be dramatic, but it is to be engaging. And because people who have gone through theological education often know how to preach, it's worth bringing some of that into your academic presentation without pulpit pounding or thundering, okay? But people do appreciate a certain amount of verbal dynamism in the presentation. The other thing they appreciate is a little bit of eye contact. So look up a lot. People will stop looking at you as soon as you stop looking at them. And as soon as they stop looking at you, they stop listening to you. So I actually will write in the margins and in the headers of my physical piece of paper that I'm reading off of, I will handwrite things like look up or smile, because otherwise I forget to do it. And it makes a lot of difference in how engaged the audience feels. If they know that you're going to be looking up at them, they're going to feel a little bit more shy about doom scrolling on Facebook while you're giving your presentation. And if you're giving a video presentation, as is becoming increasingly common, the importance of your facial expressiveness is doubly important. One of the things that I'm having to work on in relation to video presentations is that video presentations make your hand motions more exaggerated and more distracting. So if you're on a video presentation and you're a person who talks with their hands, you might have to rein in your hand motion and amplify your facial motion. We now get to the final portion of the essay, or of this presentation, excuse me, and what is for many people the most boring part of the presentation session, which is the question and answer time. We've talked about how you structure your paper, what you put in it, how you frame the language within the paper, how you help people understand what you're verbally presenting, and how you actually go about the verbal presentations. But don't write off the importance of the Q&A session. Sometimes people write it off because they don't actually understand what the real goal of a Q&A session should be. The real goal of a Q&A session is not to answer questions. Now, I know that notionally, the goal of a question and answer session is to provide your audience with a chance to understand your argument better, or it's an opportunity for you to get more helpful feedback. But let's be honest, in reality, I only feel like I get helpful feedback maybe 20% of the time in the presentations that I give. And half the time, I'm not convinced that the exchange that we have is illuminating for anybody in the audience. I actually think that, especially for early career scholars, your real goal for the Q&A is to get people to decide that you're the kind of person that they want to keep running into at future conferences, including the ones they host, in the pages of publications, including the ones that they edit, and perhaps in the halls of their own school. That's your goal in the Q&A session, to be the sort of person that people want to run into again. Now, to that end, do not get defensive during the Q&A. Do not get defensive, do not get defensive, do not get defensive, because it always looks bad. Also, and this is hard, make sure you take your time to understand the question before jumping into answer. I know that my tendency when there's a question is that I am trying to be ready to answer it when I'm halfway through the question. But it's very often that the first half of the question is really actually the person rambling before they actually get to their question at the end. So go ahead and listen to the whole question, take your time, and make sure that you know what they're asking. You can even invite clarification if you're not sure you know what they're asking before you actually try to answer. Because it's very irritating, it's very kind of embarrassing when you give what you think was a compelling answer and the person's like, yeah, that's not what I was asking. Now, I told you earlier on, don't spend a lot of time on caveats in your presentations. That said, once you get to the Q&A, it's totally fine to say that something falls outside the parameters of your thesis. It's also fine to say, gosh, I don't know the answer to your question. It's also fine to say, well, I'm not really sure, but my instinct would be to say, da, da, da. If it happens that you don't have a lot to say in response to a question, don't wander around trying to find something coherent to utter. Just answer concisely with what it is that you do want to say. Additionally, if you want to, you can invite the person who asked the question what they suspect the answer would be, or to share any literature recommendations that they think would be helpful to you. Because the only thing better than asking a good question and getting a good answer is asking a good question and then getting to talk about what you wanted to say anyway. Now, if the person's question makes you think, ooh, something I said in my paper might be wrong, don't get defensive. Instead, the right response is to be fascinated by the critique, okay? Whoa, you're fascinated, you write it down, you thank them, you say, man, I am going to go home to sit down and reflect really carefully on this, okay? That's a classier look, one. But two, if you screwed something up, it's better to find out now rather than when you're trying to publish it. Or heaven forbid, after it's published and other people are attacking you in writing. This is your opportunity to fix your mistakes, to own up to anything you did wrong, and to do it in a way that makes people want to invite you back. The last thing I want to add here is the Q&A and the time right after it is a great opportunity to do something kind. Might be to your fellow panelists, might be to the convener, might be to one or two of the people in the audience who asked interesting questions. This is a little chance to actually act like a Christian at an academic conference, but it's definitely a big chance to achieve the quote-unquote real goal. So this takes me back to an SBL meeting, a Society of Biblical Literature meeting in San Diego. I must have been 25, 26. It was maybe my third or fourth academic paper. And I was on a panel with a senior scholar named Bruce Longnecker, a junior scholar named Matthew Ringe, who's a few years older than me, a few years ahead of me in the program, and then this one other scholar. Now, the one other scholar, I don't actually remember her name. I only remember her bad behavior because she got very defensive during the Q&A time. An audience member criticized her paper. She got huffy, and even though she was right, she looked bad. And I remember after, an hour or so later, I ran into Lynn Kohik, whose research assistant I used to be, and she had come along to the paper and had seen this other paper. And she had commented how off-putting she found that behavior to be. And it was a cautionary tale for me. By contrast, Matthew Ringe, the student who was a few years ahead of me, he was funny. He was winsome. He made everybody laugh during the Q&A. And during the Q&A, he made the point of saying something nice about my presentation. And he said another nice thing about my presentation when we were chatting after the panel was over. And since I, like so many academics, was thirsty for affirmation, for an indication that I had done well, his kind words meant the world to me. And as a result, I have always liked Matthew Rindge. I make a point of going to his papers at conferences. I say hi to him. I talk well about his work because he said a couple nice things about me in the Q&A. Now, after that same session, I also made a point of chatting with Bruce Longnecker, the senior scholar. I got a copy of his paper. It was interesting, etc. And as it happened, Bruce Longnecker subsequently invited me to present in a seminar he was hosting the next year, and then to contribute a chapter to one of his books. And then he wrote a blurb on one of my books. So the real wins of this paper, I don't even remember what that paper was. It certainly wasn't in itself that important. The real wins of that particular session were relational. Matthew, another early career scholar in my field, became a friend rather than an enemy. And I know that in the future, if Matthew happens to disagree with me, he'll be gentle in how he expresses it, and he'll probably give me the chance to respond or clarify before he goes to print. Bruce, an established scholar, became an advocate for me, giving me opportunities to write and present and endorsing my works. So that Q&A session was a win, not because I ended up looking smart or shooting down questions. I have no recollections of whether or not either of those things happened. It was a win because I made new friends who decided that I was the sort of person they wanted to run into in the future. And that's the goal of the Q&A. So just to recap then, the goal of this talk has been to shorten your learning curve on how to give a strong conference presentation so that you can represent your institution and your research well, and that you get invited to other such events in the future. To really pull that off, you need to have a strong and clear structure. You need to have the most compelling content that's really going to win your argument for you. You need to express yourself in a way that's winsome, but not overly academic or turgid or artificial. You need to use visual aids to your advantage to help people follow your argument because you care about it more than anybody else does. So you're going to be paying more attention than anybody else is. You're going to want to make sure that you perform, that you give your paper in ways that are winsome. And you want to use your Q&A session in such a way that you ensure that at the end of it, people feel like they want to keep running into you in the future. And when all this happens, you won't be the person. If you pull all this together, you're not going to be a person that people remember not by name, but only by their bad behavior. You're going to be the person that nobody can forget because they keep inviting you back. Those are my thoughts. Evan, Evelyn, is this a good time to stop the recording?
Yeah, actually, I was wondering if we could keep it going for a little bit of discussion here in case people have questions that then the rest of our group might also have when they watch it. So, yeah. Thanks, Christopher, for that. So let's go ahead and open it up then to conversation. Questions, comments, thoughts from you all. What did you hear that was interesting to you or new, or that you'd like clarification on?
Thank you, Christopher. I turned off my camera because I couldn't stop laughing at few places. Yeah.
I am the object of much derision. I'm accustomed to that sensation. So thanks for turning off the camera to spare my feelings.
Yeah, I mean, why it made me laugh was like, anytime I was asked for presentation, like I have applied for various conferences to present, but during the COVID, I couldn't do it because it all went online and some were canceled. And I was so happy just for one reason. I was afraid of Q&A session.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and for me, the limitation is as an Indian, I can speak to the Indian crowd, I can understand their questions, but I'm afraid, like, would I follow the accent of a non-Indian person, and can I understand their thinking when they ask the question correctly? So that's what always puzzled me. And so anytime the conference is like, the first thing I'm afraid was like, how do I manage the Q&A? And I couldn't control my laughter when you said it. Like, think of it when somebody critiques us as a fantastic opportunity. I'm like, what? No way. And then you start explaining the stuff, and it's really interesting. And thanks for that encouragement. Every time somebody does present a paper, I would place myself when they're doing the Q&A question, and I would say how I would answer the question. So I went through the practice in my mind over and over again. But I think your presentation today has actually helped me think positively. Thank you so much. Yeah. So I feel like very lightened after this, that I can do something. And the second thing I want to comment on was you said to go to the primary source when you're talking about the content. So for my research paper, when I presented to my supervisor and the committee, they were excited about one thing. When I said like Gunkel, Hermann Gunkel was misunderstood by the scholars over the period, when I pointed that to them, they were like, wow, really? And I was like, I presented my entire thesis proposal. Why is Gunkel so important for them? And when I said like he was misunderstood, but then actually when you read, he's entirely proposing something different. Uh, so and then I was curious. I didn't want to go into form criticism because it's not my area of interest. But then when my professors were curious, I started studying it. It was a little too hectic because I have to deviate from my topic. But today I felt like when you shared about like looking to the primary sources, and when you're critiquing or commenting somebody, rather than using the secondary sources, if you go to the primary sources, the validity it carries. And I felt like, okay, that's what made them like my thesis topic very interesting for them. So yeah, so I actually got two insights about question and answers, and then why my thesis has been so important for my professors. They were super excited. I mean, in fact, my supervisor said like, we have never seen anybody writing the comprehensive exams or the oral interview in such a manner. So, for me, I come from India, so I thought like what fascinated them. So I actually like your presentation today helped me to understand. So when I'm writing my thesis, I know where my focus has to be. So I'm really thankful to your input today.
Oh gosh, well, that's tremendously encouraging to hear. Thank you so much. Now, it's not to say that the fact that primary sources win arguments means that you have to ignore secondary sources, but you want to be very intentional in only using secondary sources that that you think are either misunderstood. So in the Gunkel example that you've used, Gunkel became actually a methodological primary source text for you, right? So you need to clarify what Gunkel was doing, okay? And then by fixing people's reading of Gunkel as a modern primary source, you then could use Gunkel in a more interesting way for your other primary source. But you weren't just kind of saying, well, Gunkel says so-and-so, and now I've found somebody who's German and dead who happens to agree with me. You're using Gunkel to do work. And that's an important distinction. But I also tip my hat to you for impressing your examiner so much with your attentiveness, not to secondhand interpretations of what somebody like Gunkel thinks, but actually getting back to Gunkel himself as, in this case, a primary source for critical interpretation. Well done.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hayes, for this beautiful presentation. It really helped in many, many ways. One of the areas that it spoke to me was the Old Testament field is shared by so many people, so many fields actually that are, and scholars from those fields are not necessarily Christian. So need to be attentive to that fact, and also the fact that actually people, scholars, don't have necessarily thick skin all the time, and being winsome in your presentation and picking the battles very selectively. So that piece actually really spoke to me, because since we're dealing with the Pentateuch and then the documentary hypothesis, you you really standing in odds with some other scholars in the field, but how to really think carefully about it and make friends rather than foes. Though that's actually, but at the same time, actually being truthful and committed actually to a biblical reading. So that's what spoke to me. Thank you for that.
Yeah, no, that's a good word. And probably one of the filters that's helpful in figuring out, at which point am I being, where's the line between pandering and simply not being overly harsh. One of the major considerations, one of the major filters there is, what's your thesis? What's your original contribution to knowledge? What's the place that you're actually trying to get to? And if you don't need to weigh in on those other battles to get to that point, then just don't. Because you're trying to do, you're trying to make one contribution to knowledge in any given place. I think that's probably helpful. And yes, you will find people who want to niggle at X, Y, or Z aspect of your argument. But most people in the audience know when that's happening. So not allowing yourself to be drawn into that, even if it feels really hard in the moment. And I definitely have a hard time not biting on every piece of bait that's put in front of me. The goal is to be able to get yourself invited back. And so going after every single potential source of dispute is actually going to be counterproductive.
Dr. Christopher, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the paper. I mean, this is so helpful for me, especially. I have not yet presented paper anywhere, but one of the things that I'm so scared of was like Pavli. I'm afraid of the Q&A session. Maybe the paper I would be reading and having a kind of understanding and knowledge about, but then will I be able to understand people's expressions? And so that's one big deal for me. So what you have spoken was very helpful. On the other side, I always think, when I write, it looks like I write mostly very simple words, kind of not big scholarly or theological jargons that scares people, right? So, but the style in which you mentioned about vocabulary, that was very helpful. The way you took us through was making this as a kind of a fun and a joyful learning rather than a big deal kind of thing. So thank you so much for presenting. I was also very much laughing. That's why I went offline. I mean, I took off the video and then the moment I turned on, you said, Hepzibah, I got scared. So very, very thankful for this learning that you gave us today. So maybe I look forward to present next year. Also, I have not gone for any conferences so far. So I talked with my mentor this time and I look forward to attend the ETS conference in November. So my mentor also said that I can present the research topic in next year in that conference. So I look forward to it. So I see myself in all my preparation. To some extent, I have written everything. So I have seen myself in most of the places, but there's a lot of learning that took place, especially the presentation part.
Yeah.
So very much grateful.
Well, let me say two things in response to that. One, don't beat yourself up because you feel like you write in simple language. One, invariably, you're underestimating how complicated what you're saying is because of your familiarity with it. And two, people who express themselves in simple terms are actually the people that you can follow. So if I think about New Testament scholars who express themselves in simple terms, it's people like Richard Hayes and Michael Bird. These are very big name, very successful scholars. They're not people who are bending over backwards to be kind of erudite to the point of being opaque. and the reason they're big name scholars is in part because people have actually been able to assimilate what they're saying and then use them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you can read some of these academic articles that are ultra dense, and the person might feel like they've protected their flanks really well, but they don't actually get used because nobody has actually assimilated what they've said. It's just way too much work to understand somebody like that. So unless you absolutely have to fight your way through that person's article or that person's monograph, you probably don't. So if you want to have impact and you want to have uptake for your work in the wider field, erring on the side of speaking simply and clearly is smart.
Okay.
But now that two people have mentioned being nervous about the Q&A, let me say, the first time I went and gave a paper, it was at SBL in Boston. I was first year to PhD, and I remember how the table rattled because I was shaking my legs under it. And I had to like physically stop myself. I remember like being like doubled over with anxiety, and it was mostly about the Q&A because I didn't know what was going to come. That fear, the shaky hands, that's really normal. It goes away when a couple things happen. One, it goes away when you internalize what I've said earlier, that you know more about this than basically everybody, okay? Because it's your doctoral topic. So you really do know more than almost everybody in the audience. So the odds are that if the question is on topic, you have an answer. Now, the real odds are that the question will be off topic. And if the question is off topic, then you can just say that. Well, actually, that falls outside the boundaries of my thesis. And then you go to your next move, which will make people like you, which was, but I'm really curious now to know what you would say about that. And then you invite them to talk. Then they walk away feeling good. Everybody else knows that that was outside of what you were trying to argue. Once you assimilate those two things, one, if it's on your topic, you're going to have a good answer. And if it's not on your topic, then you can just say that and invite the other person to talk, and you've cleared away 90% of your problems. And then if you just go, gosh, I don't really know. That's a really good question. I'll go in and think about that. Nobody thinks less of you for it.
Yeah, that's outside the scope of my work answer, but I'm curious what you think about it. Or oh, I didn't think of that. I'll go and think about it now. Thank you so much. Those two answers are basically the only answers I ever give in conference presentations, because those are basically the only kinds of questions people ask. So you can even write it down at the bottom of your hard copy, those two answers, and just have it there in front of you, ready to speak off when you get those questions.
Pavni, one thing to add on top of that, when you're worried about whether or not you're going to understand people in your audience correctly, and I very much understand that because I've taught in languages that aren't my own, you go ahead and you say the question back to them. You say, so I think that what I've heard you asking is this. Do I have that question right? And they'll tell you if you didn't, and then you have another shot at it. So you don't have to get it right the first time. And yes, there are different iterations of English, but your English is very accessible to American English. I would imagine that American English is not overly opaque to you. If somebody's Scottish, then just don't talk to them. But other than that, I think you'll probably be okay if you allow yourself the time to say back to them what you think you've heard. And then they'll probably either say, yes, that's it. And so you know you're on the right track, or no, but then they'll clarify.
And another thing you can do along those lines is, if you're able, sometimes you may not be able to manage this, but I always try to write down a couple of key phrases from the question on my hard copy. So that then helps me when I say, I think I heard you say this. And I look down at the two brief notes that I took on their question. So that can be just another sort of way to hold your own hand, basically.
And I have definitely had multiple times where I remember in Colombia, especially my first year there, before I had the accents figured out, people from the northern coast of Colombia, they're called costeños, and they have very opaque accents. They drop a lot of consonants, they blur a lot of vowels together. They're hard to understand, even for other Colombians. And I had a student who became very dear to my wife and to me, but his name was Isaias. And Isa had this atrocious costeño accent. And I remember asking Isa to clarify a question like 3 times, and I couldn't understand it afterwards. And so I finally said, all right, Isa, I'm going to talk. And it might be that some of the things that I say answer your question. And if not, I'm sorry about that. And we can try to pick this up later. And people laughed about it, and it was fine. Especially if your early career, people are going to have a lot of patience with you. And even when people do understand the question that they're asked, I still feel like they actually only respond to it about half the time. So give yourself a whole lot of grace on this. People's expectations for your performance in the Q&A, very low. And even if you don't answer the questions really well, you can still pull off the real goal, which is that they want to keep running into you.
Karishma or Ruhama, do either of you have questions about this one?
Yeah, I'd like to comment something. And yeah, Dr. Hayes, I really appreciate, especially in the beginning itself when he told us something about the structure, and that's something that's somewhere where I struggle. Like the recent chapter that I submitted, also I noticed that I was not taking the audience right now is only my mentor, but yeah, I was not taking my mentor along with me. I was assuming a lot of things and thinking that, yeah, obviously my audience should know, but actually they do not. And so it was helpful to have those roadmaps to like a reinforcement that, yeah, I should take my audience along with me and take them along through this journey. So that was a helpful thing. And yeah, just like Hepzibah, this is going to be my first time. At SciEx, we do have something called the Doctoral Club, and every month we have some kind of a presentation, someone presenting, but I've always pushed it off my table just for the same fear of the deadly Q&A. But yeah, this is going to be my first time. And this year, towards the end of the academic year, for us, it would be close to January, March. I have to present in college. I can't push it off any further. And so I think this is going to be my first platform. Looking forward to it. I really appreciate the way you brought it up, that it's very amiable, very friendly, and it looks like, yeah, it's not too strenuous a job, not a Goliath. So yeah, thank you.
Well, I'm excited for you to have this opportunity to present and to do it at the Doctoral Club, which is your home turf, right? People are going to be sharing some presuppositions with you, and so you're being kind of eased in. And you'll have the chance, and maybe Evelyn will pounce on this and have you do a presentation with us beforehand. Most people have to do their first presentation cold. It's really normal to give your first presentation at your first conference. So you have just no idea what it's supposed to look like. So this group is intended to be a safe place for you to be able to try something out and just to get a couple of first successes under your belt. But even, back at your own school, they all want you to succeed. Okay, so they're not going to try to out you. And if you botch something, then you go back to the professor afterwards and you say, man, I feel like I answered that one wrong. What would have been a better way to do it? And it'll be a good opportunity for you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello everyone, thank you very much for that, Dr. Hayes. I actually put my video on, you won't be able to listen to me, so this has to work for today, I'm sorry. But that was a really good presentation. I really enjoyed 2 points from it. One would be making sure that our thesis or whatever argument that we're bringing to the table would be contributing to the knowledge that's out there, but not to be frustrated too much about it, because that's already a big job. I have been going back and forth with my work, as it has already been done a lot in it, but also not very significant work. So making sure to find the balance between, am I really contributing something significant, or is it just a paper that's being presented, is something that I have continually been thinking through and struggling. So I guess finding that balance is one of the main important things that I really want to see. And the other one would be the idea of presenting yourself as light but also academic person, um, making sure that you hold the attention of the people that are listening to you. Because I mean, as teachers, I don't know, yeah, there's our teachers, but as teachers in classes, that's something you usually practice. But when it comes to like peer-reviewed sessions, I think that's going to be very difficult. So how, how do you make sure that you have that respectable stand as well as making sure that people listen to you? Because I was just at a seminar a few weeks ago. Um, the lady who was presenting did a marvelous job at what she had done, but then there was a Q&A, and then there was a second discussion session after it, and people actually said some things that were she was not happy about. So she came a bit beat her back into the next session, and that put everybody off from going forward. So making sure how you respond to what people actually receive from you is something I think very crucial. So thank you for that presentation, Dr. Hayes.
Yeah, you're welcome. Um, I mean, especially if you're presenting in the West, what nobody wants to have happen is have you delay something else. So letting something go is always a better move than, you know, being like a dog with the bone that won't let it go. And you made the comment about kind of, I guess I heard behind your comment some of the emotions around feeling like you have to say something really important when you have this audience in front of you. And nobody expects you to say something super important. People expect you to be making some kind of a contribution to knowledge that will be stimulating to them. And even if, invariably when you're saying something original, the tip of the iceberg might be original, but most of what you said isn't original and it's using what's been built before. But the fact that it's using what's been built before doesn't mean that your audience is going to know most of it. So they'll be learning a lot, even though some of what you say is going to be not entirely original to the guild. It will be original to them. The other thing is just be kind to yourself as you enter this space. It's really easy to beat yourself up in the academy. And it is probably you who will scar yourself more than anybody else when it comes to academic performance. So watch the way that you talk to yourself after it's over. Don't allow yourself to say, oh, God, I look so stupid. Gosh, that was an idiot. Oh, this was a terrible thing to say. I just can't do this. I'm not cut out. Don't do that. Nobody else is going to be doing that. And if you're early in your career, you're at a pretty fragile state. And the things that you say to yourself will probably be things that you keep saying to yourself afterwards. So practice some self-kindness in advance, and that's going to be a way in which you're a good steward of your career going forward.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Christopher.